The one thing I want people to take away is to not feel like you have to start by creating an enormous complex branching scenario as your first project. L&D professionals overall do need to be good writers. I think it's an underestimated skill. If I'm doing software training, frankly, I don't generally think that scenario-based learning is the right thing for most software training.
Welcome to another episode of Genius Talk, where we pick the brains of thought leaders from the world of L&D. I'm Apurva, your session host for tonight, and I'm also an L&D marketer from Animaker. For the people who don't know, Animaker is an AI animation platform with over 30 million users across the globe, and out of which 1/3 of them are actually L&D creators. In today's episode, we are going to be discussing about the topic, the fun and effectiveness of using scenario-based learning, and we have got Christy Tucker with us. And hi, Christy. Super happy to have you. Okay, so a quick introduction about Christy. So Christy is actually a learning experience design consultant with over 20 years of experience. She has her own consultancy called Syniad Learning, and she specializes in creating fun and engaging scenario-based learning solutions for learners, which helps them in their real-life work environment. And she has worked with multiple organizations across the globe and has helped them with their learning solutions. And she is also an international speaker and constantly advocates about scenario-based learning and other L&D related topics in her blogs and also on her LinkedIn profiles. If you're somebody who's new to L&D, you should probably check out her LinkedIn profile. It is super useful. And hi, once again, super happy to have you with us. And I'm sure it's going to be a very useful session for our viewers. And yeah.
Well, thank you for having me on. And I hope that it is useful.
Okay, so Christy, this interview session is divided into 3 parts. The first part is called the Genius Journey, where we'll be talking about your incredible career journey. And the second part of the interview is called Picking Genius Mind, where we'll get into the topic of the day, that is scenario-based learning. And the last and the final part of the interview is rapid fire round, which is my favorite part. And so without any further ado, I think we can get started with the interview. So the first part of the interview, the Genius Journey. So when I was doing my research about you on all the online resources, I found that you started your career as a music teacher, and now you are an L&D professional. First of all, I was mind blown by the contrast in both the fields. And how did the transition happen, Christy?
So yeah, I taught music and band in the public schools in the US. I taught my first year of teaching. I taught in a school where they had everything from kindergartners, so 5-year-olds through 18-year-olds all in one building, in a little rural school in Illinois. And I taught high school band, high school music appreciation, junior high band, fifth grade band lessons, and general music for kindergarten, first grade, third grade, and fifth grade, and high school lunch supervision. So it was a lot of different things. So I did all of that. And I taught middle school music, and from there I taught for 3 years, and there's lots of great things that I liked about teaching, but it really wasn't the best fit for me, partly because when you are teaching, you are on stage all the time. Like, you are up in front and you are talking and you are interacting with people. And among other things, I realized that I am more introverted than that. You know, we all have that scale of where we are on the introvert-extrovert spectrum. And I can't be on and in front of people that much of the time. I enjoy doing it some. I enjoy doing conversations like this one-on-one. But managing 14-year-olds for 90 minutes, 6 hours a day is not actually where my strengths lie. So I did corporate training for a while. I did software training, did stand-up training. And then I realized that I missed the planning part of things. Again, it was that like I was still on stage too much, even when I liked working with adult learners. But I missed the planning part of it, the lesson planning. And so when I was researching careers, I found instructional design and started reading online and teaching myself, and spent a long time applying before I got that first job. But it's now been 20 years of working in instructional design.
Wow. That's actually a very inspiring story for anybody, because you didn't have a direct link, you didn't have a proper plan to any of this, right? Yeah, it will be definitely interesting for the people who are watching this. So with that, we are done with the part 1 of the interview. Now we are getting to the juicy part of the interview, that is scenario-based learning. That is part 2, picking the genius mind. So let's start with the basic question first. So when we hear about the term scenario-based learning, we hear a lot of definitions associated with it. So if I had to ask you to explain about it in simple terms, what would it be? Along with that, I have another question as well. So when we talk about scenario-based learning, we always also associate it with, we also talk about branching scenarios, and it looks like as if both are similar terms, but you have mentioned that branching scenarios is one of the types of scenarios. It's not it is not scenario-based learning. So if there are many types of scenarios, can you tell some of the types and differences between them as well?
Yes. So I think in terms of defining scenario-based learning, we'll start with an extremely self-referential definition, which is, I think that I would call anything that is learning through scenarios falls under that broader umbrella of scenario-based learning. And so by scenario here, I mean a story or a situation that is used specifically for learning. Now, we use stories in training sometimes just to gain attention, and right, you might tell the funny joke story just to get people's attention. That I will say is a story, but probably not scenario-based learning. An example of something where somebody did it the right way and they were successful, or somebody did it the wrong way and weren't successful, is potentially a scenario, and it is used for training, and I think that might be scenario-based learning in that case. The branching scenarios are definitely one of the primary ones, but I would say that is a subset of scenario-based learning. One of the other real common ones that I use for approaches is mini scenarios, sort of one question mini scenarios. In fact, if I'm working with an organization that's never done any scenario-based learning, I don't start with, hey, let's do a 75-slide complex branching scenario with 8 different endings and a bunch of, variables and scoring and fancy multimedia. That is not the starting point. We start with, hey, you've got this multiple choice knowledge check that you're doing. What if instead of just asking people if they remember the thing that they heard 5 minutes ago, what if we put that into a scenario and have them apply it a little bit more? And almost always, even if people are resistant to, I think that other thing is too complex and I don't know if we have the resources, and I can almost always convince people to do a scenario-based question or a practice. It is a way for organizations to just get a little taste, a little sample of scenario-based learning, and to try it out and get a reaction from their learners and see how it goes. And once they've done that, then it's easier to say, okay, well, maybe we'll do a short scenario as a practice. Okay, now maybe, and you can grow it over time. But the branching scenario is not necessarily the first place to start, because it does in fact require some more effort to build it, especially a more complex one. So those mini scenarios are often, I've had times where, yes, I blog about branching scenarios because I think that the complex thing, but also what I actually do with clients is often a lot of these mini scenarios because they're very useful. Even if we're doing a very linear course, throwing in a couple of scenario questions as practice can be really useful and can amp up even a pretty traditional e-learning course.
True. Also, I feel like branching scenarios require a lot of time and thinking to come up with compared to mini scenarios, right? It's easier to get started on the, as you said, it can be a good starting point for the company to get started on it.
Yes.
Yeah, which leads me to my next question, that is, what is the ideal situation to use, like when would you say it's ideal to use SBL in your training? And when you have decided that, as you mentioned, like you try to start with mini scenarios, so how do you assign that this is the type of scenario that I'm going to start with? Like, how do you assign the type to the situation?
Yeah. So much of it does depend on understanding at the beginning, well, what kind of skill are we practicing here? Because, if you're thinking about the kind of skill that is really where you do just need a little bit of awareness or recognition of things, okay, frankly, you barely need any practice at all. It really is, or maybe you need very, very short. If it's something very procedural, where there's a checklist and where the process is going to be the same every time you do it, then that's probably something where if the process is very linear, the practice exercise that you're creating should also probably be fairly linear, right? You're going to have, maybe you do have a realistic practice, but it's going to be linear. You practice it in context. It might be a series of mini scenario kind of questions, but it's all a linear path. You're not going to branch out. Or you have them, practice doing the thing, and here's the checklist, practice using the checklist that you're actually going to use on the job. I've done some where it is, here's a photo of the work site, and here's your checklist that you're supposed to be looking for problems on the site. Go through this checklist and check off what are the problems that you see, and then we'll go through and we'll remediate that. It's not branching. It is still a scenario, right? It is a situation, but that is something where the important skill that I need them to do is not to remember everything. They're not going to remember everything. The skill that I want them to do is to learn how to use this audit checklist to check for things. So I want the practice to reflect what they're actually doing. Branching scenarios are really good when you have a series of decisions, right? So it's decision-making practice. And especially where you have a series of decisions that are interconnected, where the first decision affects what options you would even have available in a second decision. That works really well for conversation simulation. So a lot of the work that I've done is often practicing soft skills and conversation skills, right? That's one of the places where it clearly works. But also things like troubleshooting, where the test that you run is going to give you information that opens up other paths. Or if you're, or project management, where if you wait to get client information or you proceed ahead, those are going to end up giving you different options down the road. Those kinds of strategic decisions are really good fits for branching scenarios. It's also good if it is things where there's not a black and white answer. Right? If you're talking in a conversation, there might be an ideal path, but if you make a mistake, if you ask a closed question, ask a yes or no question instead of an open-ended question, in real life, you can recover from that. You'll get the one-word answer, and then you'll realize, oh, right, I was supposed to ask an open-ended question here. And then you'll go back and you'll ask the open-ended question, and you get the response that you were going to get anyway. And so branching scenarios are good for those sorts of things where there's more than one right answer, or you're dealing with trade-offs that are, more strategic. Project management of the good, fast, and cheap, pick any two. Those are trade-offs that you can model in a project management scenario or a simulation. Budgeting, where, depends on what's more important to you. There are skills where if you give 3 different web developers a brief for, I want a website for my company, and you give them all of your requirements, you will get 3 very different answers. Because that's all strategic skill, and there's a lot of decisions to make there, and a lot of trade-offs. that's the kind of skill for which branching scenarios are a good fit.
Wow, I think it was pretty clear. That was a good definition. So even now you mentioned that the effectiveness of the scenario-based learning is very high when the employee is able to immediately use it in their work. Like if they are immediately able to learn it and go do their task. So which also aligns with what microlearning does. It is bite-sized, it is very quick. You pull it up when you are in absolute necessity to learn something, and you immediately apply it in your job. So is there a way where you can collaborate both microlearning and scenario-based learning? Is there a possibility? Have you done that? Can you elaborate about it?
Sure. So I think that for one thing, you can do short scenarios. The scenarios do not all necessarily need to be big. And in fact, it is generally better to have maybe multiple smaller scenarios rather than one enormous scenario. For most L&D projects, we really are not dealing with the kind of AAA video game budget where you're going to have something that's an hour long. There are those situations, and that's an exception, I think, rather than most of the day-to-day work that most L&D people are doing. Smaller is better. So if you have something that is a smaller scenario, maybe I'm doing some right now for a client where we're going to have 3 or 4 decisions total. So they're going to be less than 5-minute activities.
Wow.
But it's a little bit to just prompt a discussion. I had another project where the client had found that in the training, they had a much longer training to introduce some skills. And this was definitely communication skills, and there were some mini scenarios throughout that. But what they found was some of the tougher situations where there was more gray area, people really weren't getting. And part of the problem was they'd get the training when they were new at the job, and they needed some more later as reinforcement. And so what we ended up doing was creating a series of 5 or 6 short scenarios that were just the follow-up, that were the 1 or 2 question mini scenarios as follow-up that could be emailed out in a sequence after. So you'd finish the whole main program, and then a month later you'd get one of these scenarios, and a month after that, or 2 weeks later, you'd get one scenario that gave you some things, and then had some reflection questions to think about it, or to talk with your manager or talk with your peers about, well, how would you do that in this situation? Yeah, and so it was a spaced learning. It was the spaced learning version of the microlearning, and I think that tends to be what it is. I don't think that you end up with scenarios quite so much for the learning and the workflow learning. I think that that's a trickier thing. If I'm doing software training, frankly, I don't generally think that scenario-based learning is the right thing for most software training. It is more effective to just do a straightforward screencast video and to not make a story up for it. 80 or 90% of software training should not be scenario-based learning. It's kind of special edge cases where it makes more sense.
I think what you're saying is sometimes it's better to know what not to do than what to do, and sometimes you should know that when it's not appropriate to use it, so that it really brings you to a point where you can actually do it. So yeah.
Right.
So another term that always clashes with scenario-based learning is gamification. People always talk about it as if they are quite similar to each other, but I believe it's not. And can you tell me the differences between gamification and scenario-based learning, and how you can use it together to create an immersive learning experience?
Yeah, I would agree with you that gamification and scenario-based learning are not the same, but there is overlap between them. So if we take gamification, I think Karl Kopp is the expert on games for learning. And he talks about in his Games and Gamification for Learning book, he does talk about defining gamification as learning and training where we use elements of games that make games effective and we use them in training. Often what we see as gamification is very shallow. It's points, badges, and leaderboards. We do those sorts of things. And not that those are completely ineffective. I have a long streak on Duolingo right now, and I am on the leaderboard, and I'm in the Diamond League. I am not in the tournament, but I am absolutely on the leaderboard and have a friend's quest and have the streak, and all of those gamification things absolutely are keeping me motivated to keep going in and logging into Duolingo and doing my one lesson of German per day. Right? So it can work. Like, those things can work, but that's not the only elements of a game that can work. Games also work because they have good stories, right? A lot of games have a pretty significant amount of narrative in them. They have decisions. You do things, you have an active role, and you see things happen. Games also do a great job at giving you lots of different kinds of feedback, right? When you play a city building simulation game, you get feedback. How much money is your city making? How many resources are you burning? How happy is your population? All of that is feedback. They're not telling you it's right or wrong.
It's a feedback, yeah.
But it is feedback, and it's feedback shown in a lot of different ways without telling you overtly that it's correct or incorrect. So there are elements of games that we can definitely use in scenario-based learning. We can take things from games, not necessarily leaderboards. I think are often problematic in training, but there are certainly other elements of games that we can use in branching scenarios and make them more effective.
I think gamification is not exactly game, but using the game's core to enhance the learning experience. I think you've beautifully put the differences between them, and you've also told the way how you can blend it together and bring it to life. I think that's a great explanation. We have been discussing about a lot of different things under the broader topic of scenario-based learning, but trust me, we have just touched the surface. This is just the part 1 of our conversation. If you want to hear more from Christy, where she discusses about how to create a challenging yet a supportive SBL program for the learners to move forward, then don't miss out the part 2 of the interview. Please head over to Animaker Genius Talk with Christy Tucker part 2 to continue watching this amazing discussion.